She was at the foot of the cross when almost everyone fled. She was the first to find the empty tomb, the woman who witnessed the resurrection, and yet was transformed by official history into an anonymous and repentant sinner. What happened to Mary Magdalene? Why did early Christianity value her as one of Jesus's closest disciples, but centuries later she was reduced to a symbol of moral error? This is the dark side of institutionalized faith, the distortion of one of the most spiritual and daring figures in the Gospels. Have you ever stopped to think about why so many ancient texts speak of Mary Magdalene as a leader, mystic and wise, while others simply silence her? And most intriguingly, why did some apostles like Peter seem uncomfortable with his presence? The apocryphal Gospels, such as those of Mary, Philip and Thomas, reveal clues about an apostolic dispute that divided the nascent church. These texts, hidden for centuries, suggest that Magdalene was more than she dared say in pulpits and catechisms. During the Middle Ages, with the strength of figures such as Gregory the Great, the image of the saint was fused with that of other biblical women, such as the nameless sinner or the adulterous woman. Result: a stereotype that fueled centuries of religious misogyny and erased the legacy of a woman who, according to many modern scholars, was a true symbol of wisdom and spiritual leadership. The problem is not just historical, it still echoes in the present, influencing the role of women in the church and in the faith spheres of power. But something has been changing, thanks to the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts, contemporary biblical scholarship, and the movement for gender equality in faith. The true Mary Magdalene is beginning to emerge. A woman from Magdala with a deep spiritual experience, respected as a guide and inspirer. In this content, we will delve into her journey, from questioning girl to silenced disciple, revealing not only her pain, but her strength. Because knowing the real Mary Magdalene can transform the way you see Christianity, the feminine, and even yourself. Few people know, but Mary Magdalene was much more than the repentant woman we were taught to see. In early Christianity, she was a constant presence, a prominent disciple of Jesus, close enough to be a witness to the resurrection, the most crucial moment in the Christian faith. While others hid in fear, she stood firm, showing a courage that few men had. Yet for centuries, his true identity was shrouded in a fog of silence, doubt, and distortion. In the canonical Gospels, she appears at decisive moments. But it is in the apocryphal Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mary, that its importance overflows. There, she is portrayed as someone who deeply understands the spiritual teachings of Christ and even transmits them to the other disciples. But that bothered me, and a lot. Mainly figures like Pedro, who, according to these reports, questioned his authority. The apostolic dispute was real, and Mary was at the center of it, challenging the established order because she was a woman and yet a leader. Over time, the institutionalization of the church needed symbols that supported its authority. And Mary Magdalene, so free, so spiritual, did not serve this role. From then on, a subtle and effective process of ecclesiastical censorship began. Her image was reformulated until it fit into an acceptable stereotype for the time, that of the repentant sinner. This transformation was not a coincidence, but rather an intentional construction, based on speeches such as that of Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. The result? For centuries, millions knew only the Magdalene of penance, while the true disciple remained forgotten. That's why today, revisiting its history is not just an act of historical curiosity, it's a gesture of reparation. We are talking about a woman who represents not only popular religiosity, but also a key to understanding the hidden potential of female leadership in early Christianity. And understanding this takes us directly to where it all began, a village called Magdala. Mary was born in Magdala, a city on the Sea of Galilee, known for its fish trade and prosperous life. Unlike the austere image that is sometimes painted of the biblical world, Magdala was a vibrant city with well-structured houses, busy markets, and of course social tensions. Maria grew up in a wealthy family, which guaranteed her a certain material security, but did not free her from the limits imposed on women. From an early age, she saw how access to education was restricted for girls, even those with good conditions. Despite this, something about Maria caught our attention: an early spiritual restlessness. While other girls learned domestic tasks, she observed religious discussions by the men in the house and asked questions considered inappropriate. Local religiosity was intense, but very focused on formality. It was in this context that his soul began to search for something deeper, something that escaped the cold rules of orthodoxy. At a young age, she began to develop a spiritual sensitivity that not even her family could fully understand. The contrasts in Magdalene were stark. On the one hand, there were rigid rituals and traditions. On the other, Hellenistic influences brought new ideas, philosophies, and ways of seeing the world. Maria grew up at this cultural intersection, learning to observe with critical eyes. This experience taught her not to accept everything as absolute. Magdalene's environment, both restrictive and cosmopolitan, shaped an inquiring mind and a heart open to the sacred, a combination that would later make her a tireless seeker for deeper spiritual truths. It's curious to think that, if she were alive today, Mary would perhaps be the type of young woman who fills bookstores looking for authors like C.S. Lewis, Elaine Pagels, or even Eastern mystics. She wanted to understand God, not just through texts, but through direct experience. Maybe you've felt this too at some point, that feeling that there is something beyond what the eyes see and the rules explain. It was in Magdalene that this fire began to burn within her, a fire that would guide her along unthinkable paths, including towards a transformative encounter with a certain rabbi named Jesus. In Maria's youth, Magdalene was a true cauldron of tensions. On the one hand, there was the strict Jewish orthodoxy, which regulated life in detail, from what to wear to how to pray. On the other hand, the influence of Hellenism was growing, with its philosophical ideas, art, and freedom of thought. Maria lived between two worlds, that of family religious traditions and that of new ideas that circulated in the markets and squares. This duality awakened in her a sharp, critical sense, especially in relation to the limited role that was imposed on women. While men could attend rabbinical schools and study the scriptures, women were left on the sidelines of spiritual formation. Maria realized the absurdity of this. How can we truly seek God if only half of humanity was allowed to know Him in depth? She saw the limitations her own mother faced and, at the same time, heard Greek travelers talk about the soul, freedom and love as paths to the divine. These experiences not only challenged his beliefs, but also strengthened his desire to have a spiritual experience of his own. Maria's adolescence was marked by this discomfort with the status quo, and it wasn't easy. Questioning meant taking risks, rejection, isolation, and even punishment, but she wouldn't shut up. He began to move away from rituals that no longer made sense and sought answers outside traditional structures. Maybe you know this feeling, when everything seems right to others, but inside you something screams that something essential is missing. It was like that with Maria. This restlessness was his silent school, shaping his inner strength. This internal and external conflict planted the seeds of the boldness she would demonstrate in the future. Mary didn't just want to hear about God, she wanted to meet Him, and this prepared her for a path much more radical than she could have imagined. By experiencing these cultural and religious tensions, she learned that true faith requires courage, and it was precisely this courage that led her to break with the predictable and embark on a journey that would place her at the center of one of the greatest spiritual revolutions in history. The movement started by Jesus of Nazareth. From an early age, Maria Magdalene demonstrated an unusual sensitivity to the invisible. As a teenager, he began to have intense visions, vivid dreams, and moments of spiritual ecstasy that he could not explain. In a society where mystical feminine manifestations were viewed with suspicion or as signs of imbalance, Maria learned to keep her experiences silent. But internally, these experiences already shaped a deep connection with the divine. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a calling. These mystical moments were not accompanied by dogmas or formulas. They were like windows open to a dimension of peace, light, and wisdom that transcended everything she had heard in formal services. Over time, she came to recognize these episodes as legitimate spiritual experiences rather than illusions of the mind. This type of contact with the sacred was closer to what the Gnostics would later call inner knowledge, direct knowledge, experienced firsthand, and not just learned in books or synagogues. If you've ever had the feeling of being guided by something bigger, even without knowing what it was, you understand Maria. Instead of remaining silent, she began to notice the patterns in these experiences. Nature, silence, solitude, all of this favored his states of deeper perception. There was still no doctrine that validated her, but what she lived had the weight of an intimate truth. It was this sincere search that made her realize that her faith did not depend on intermediaries. It was personal, alive, and transformative, and it was precisely this awakening that prepared the ground for the most important encounter of his life, Jesus. When she first heard him, something in his words resonated like an echo of the vision she already had. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. She saw him not just as a master, but as a mirror of her own quest. This spiritual link, woven even in her youth, would later explain why Mary would be one of the few people who would understand the deeper dimensions of Christ's teachings. But this is just beginning. The meeting between Mary Magdalene and Jesus was a watershed, not only for her, but for the entire history of early Christianity. When she heard him teach, she didn't just feel curious. He felt that finally, someone spoke the language of his soul. Jesus did not see her as a woman to be corrected, but as a genuine seeker of truth. He welcomed his spiritual experience as something legitimate and worthy. This marked her deeply because, for the first time, someone validated what had always been invisible to the eyes of the world. Maria was no ordinary follower. Unlike most, she received private teachings, often in intimate moments and away from crowds. The apocryphal Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mary, reveal that Jesus trusted her in a unique way. He instructed her on lofty spiritual topics such as the ascension of the soul and the true nature of the kingdom of God. These themes, complex and often symbolic, required someone with mystical sensitivity, and Maria was that person. Her listening went beyond words. She absorbed the essence. Naturally, this caused discomfort. Within the group of disciples, there were those who did not understand this closeness, including Peter. The Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip suggest that there was tension between them, with Peter questioning why Jesus talked to a woman so much. This apostolic dispute was not just about gender, but about spiritual authority. Mary did not seek leadership out of ambition, but her understanding of Christ's words placed her as a reference among others, which challenged well-established patriarchal structures. This relationship with Jesus broke paradigms. He didn't just teach her, he empowered her. Mary became not only a disciple, but a witness to the resurrection, the first to see him alive after death. This was not accidental. It was the recognition that his faith, his search, and his surrender were authentic. Jesus chose her for a mission that required courage and clarity, announcing life where others only saw an end. It was this gesture that sealed his place in history, not as an extra, but as a protagonist of the Christian mythology that was being created, and the conflict it generated still echoes. While the canonical Gospels gave Mary Magdalene an important role, it was the apocryphal Gospels that revealed her true spiritual and intellectual depth. Texts such as the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, and Gospel of Thomas, discovered in part in the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, portray Mary as a spiritual leader and teacher among the disciples. She was not just the woman who saw the resurrected Christ. She understood the teachings in a dimension that went beyond the literal. This made her different, and for some, dangerous. In the accounts of these texts, Mary receives revelations directly from Jesus after the resurrection, when others were still confused or fearful. She shares complex spiritual insights and interpretations, touching on Gnostic themes such as soul liberation and inner knowledge. But instead of being received with enthusiasm, his teachings are met with resistance. Pedro, in particular, contests her authority, going so far as to say that he cannot accept that the Master has entrusted such revelations to her. The apostolic dispute intensifies at this point. This tension between Mary and Peter represents something much larger, the clash between two models of the Church, one based on institutional and hierarchical authority, symbolized by Pedro, another centered on direct spiritual experience and intimate knowledge of God, embodied by Mary. The discussion between them, recorded in apocryphal texts, is more than a personal clash. It is the seed of a polarity that runs through the entire history of Christianity. And not by chance, Mary's voice ended up being silenced in the following centuries in a process of ecclesiastical censorship. But what these Gospels reveal still bothers and inspires today. For modern scholars and faith seekers, they open the way for a reinterpretation of Christian spirituality, in which female leadership, mysticism, and gender equality have legitimate space. At the same time, they make us ask, what else was left out of the official narrative? And what can Mary's firm presence, resisting amidst disputes and exclusions, teach us about resilience and spiritual wisdom? The answer perhaps lies in the way in which its image was radically transformed in the following centuries. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great made a historic and perhaps strategic error that would shape the image of Mary Magdalene for more than 1,000 years. In a famous sermon, he unified 3 different women mentioned in the Gospels: Mary Magdalene, the anonymous sinner who anoints Jesus' feet, and Mary of Bethany. The result? The true spiritual disciple was transformed into a symbol of the repentant sinner. It wasn't just a mistake in identification, it was a symbolic operation that completely redefined his legacy. This new version of Mary Magdalene was useful for the medieval church, which needed female models to reinforce submission, repentance, and penance. The image of the mystical, wise woman who led and taught was too inconvenient. In its place, the figure of the redeemed former prostitute appeared, whose greatest glory was crying at the feet of the Savior. And so, through a sermon, the name of Mary Magdalene was diverted from its original course and plunged into a narrative of guilt and moralism. One of the greatest erasures in religious history, this representation had profound consequences for popular religiosity. Paintings, sermons, plays, and traditions began to portray her with red clothes, loose hair, and a penitent posture. Magdalene became the sinner par excellence, the icon of the woman who makes mistakes and corrects herself, but who never leads or teaches. This reinforced religious misogyny, limiting women's space not only in the scriptures, but also in the practical life of the church. After all, if even Jesus' greatest female disciple was reduced to an example of sin, what was left for the others? However, the most curious thing is that this error was sustained for centuries, even when dissonant voices began to emerge. It was only very recently, with the advancement of biblical studies and the recovery of apocryphal texts, that this image began to be deconstructed. Modern theology, combined with archaeology and literary analysis, is helping to restore Mary Magdalene to her rightful place. But the question remains, why was this error so convenient for so long? Maybe because silencing spiritually powerful women has always been easier than listening to them. During the Middle Ages, the figure of Mary Magdalene was domesticated by the dominant narrative of the Church. She who in the first centuries was remembered as a disciple of Jesus, bearer of wisdom and witness to the resurrection, began to be represented almost exclusively as a repentant, isolated, and penitent woman. Ecclesiastical censorship was not explicit as a decree, but acted in a constant and strategic way, by omission, erasure, and replacement of his image with a version convenient to the clerical power. This censorship was manifested in the cultural and artistic practices of the time. Texts that showed Mary as a leader were being marginalized. The apocryphal Gospels disappeared from official readings. Meanwhile, artwork depicted her in caves, dressed in rags, covered in long, disheveled hair, a symbol of extreme penance. It was as if they were shouting, "This is the woman who dared to get too close to the divine, and for that reason she was reduced to solitude." The female leadership she represented has been diluted into legend, metaphor, and fear. This process also reflected an institutional fear that women would have direct access to the sacred. Magdalene, with her authentic spiritual experience, put the monopoly of male theological interpretation at risk. After all, if a woman could hear and teach spiritual truth, why depend on priests and bishops? Therefore, censorship was not just a question of image, it was a strategy for controlling religious discourse. Faith needed order, and free women like Mary did not fit into the imposed model of docility. Even so, Mary Magdalene never completely disappeared. His name continued to echo in popular traditions, local devotions, and mystical sanctuaries. Amidst the attempt to silence her, a silent resistance emerged. It was as if the collective memory itself refused to let it die. And this brings us to a fascinating point. No matter how much official history tried to erase her, something in Mary Magdalene persisted. And this something would begin to gain new strength in the following centuries, with a surprising movement of rediscovery and modern rehabilitation. From the 19th century onwards, scholars and theologians began to distrust the traditional image of Mary Magdalene. Serious researchers such as Ernest Renan and later Karen King noticed inconsistencies between biblical texts and the way she was portrayed throughout history. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 was a watershed. There were fragments of Gospels previously considered lost, and in them, Mary appeared as the central voice, a symbol of wisdom, not sin. It was the beginning of his modern rehabilitation. These discoveries were echoed in universities, research centers, and alternative religious groups. The idea that Magdalene was deliberately silenced found fertile ground in times of criticism of religious misogyny and appreciation of the role of women in the church. Little by little, she stopped being just an object of penitent devotion to become an intellectual, theological, and spiritual inspiration. Gender equality movements in faith began to see her as a precursor, not only because of what she suffered, but because of what she represented from the beginning, the union between the divine and the feminine. Contemporary authors explore his figure from various perspectives. While Dan Brown, in the Da Vinci Code, popularized a more romantic and conspiratorial version, others, such as Cynthia Bourgeault and Elaine Pagels, delved into its mystical dimension. Courses in theology, feminine spirituality, and Christian mysticism today dedicate entire chapters to her life. Independent churches celebrate Mary Magdalene as a saint and spiritual master. All of this points to a collective desire to recover what was lost, and perhaps also a call to live a broader and more authentic faith. This rehabilitation, however, is not just academic or symbolic. It impacts the way many people live their faith on a daily basis. Women feel authorized to lead, question, teach. Men start to review their own spirituality without fear of making space for the feminine. And above all, Christianity gains a new chance to look at its origins without dogmatic filters. The name of Mary Magdalene is once again pronounced with reverence and admiration. And that brings us to the present moment, where his legacy is finally breathing freely again. Today, Mary Magdalene resurfaces with surprising strength. She's no longer seen just as a biblical character, but as a symbol of wisdom, intuition, and resistance. In a world that still debates the place of women in faith, she represents the balance between deep spirituality and historic courage. Her figure inspires books, films, songs, and even spiritual retreats dedicated to the sacred feminine. From the altar of churches to alternative study circles, Mary Magdalene once again occupied the space that had been denied to her for centuries. In the academic field, her name appears prominently in research on Gnosticism, apocryphal Gospels, and female leadership in early Christianity. In progressive Christian communities, she is celebrated as an apostle to the apostles, a pioneer of gender equality in the faith. Even within the Catholic Church, there are movements that defend its official revaluation. In 2016, the Vatican recognized her as Apostle of the Apostles, a late but significant gesture, a sign that his memory is still alive and that there is still a lot to be repaired. In addition to religious spaces, Mary also gained relevance as a psychological and spiritual archetype. Psychotherapists and scholars of the soul see her as a model of an integrated woman, one who moves between light and shadow, reason and emotion, flesh and spirit. Not surprisingly, her story resonates with people who feel marginalized by institutional religion. Magdalene, the silenced one, became the voice of many, and if you've ever felt like your faith needed more freedom, more depth, more truth, maybe that's who you need to talk to. Today, in times of global spiritual transformation, Mary Magdalene is not just remembered, she is lived. In Magdala, his hometown, excavations reveal the past as pilgrims seek inspiration. On social media, theologians and content creators rescue their story with passion. In popular religiosity, she reappears as a guide, healer, sister on the journey. And perhaps more than ever, his presence challenges us to rewrite faith not as a repetition of the past, but as a path to freedom. Because at the end of the day, Mary Magdalene keeps calling us to see, hear, and believe for ourselves. And now that you have walked this path with me, from the sands of Magdala to the hidden scenes of the history of faith, tell me, how many truths are still hidden behind convenient interpretations? The story of Mary Magdalene invites us to look beyond the surface, to question what was taught as absolute, and to rediscover the divine where we least expected it, within ourselves. She wasn't just a supporting character. It was a guide, a bridge, an echo of the voice of Christ who still calls us. Haven't you also been taught to shut up when you feel something different from the norm? Have you ever thought about how many Mary Magdalene's history has silenced, and how much of your strength still lives within you? As we reflect on all of this, it becomes clear we are not just talking about theology, but about a personal revolution. And perhaps this is your moment to break away from fixed narratives, rediscover your own spirituality, and take a more active role in your journey of faith. From now on, you can choose how to carry this truth. Maybe start by reading the Gospel of Mary, or sharing this content with someone who, like you, needs to see that faith and freedom do not need to be on opposite sides. Maybe you'll start leading a study group, or simply silence the external noise and listen to the inner voice, like Magdalene did. If this story touched you, inspired you, or awakened any doubts that still pulse in your chest, don't go away in silence. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and follow the next videos. Here, we continue to unearth forgotten truths, illuminating shadows and opening space for a more human, profound, and real Christianity.